Now, honestly, I'm re-recording this topic for far too many a time because I want to get it right. You see, as alternate histories go, this is both one of the most believable scenarios and one of the hardest scenarios to work. Why is it one of the most believable scenarios? Because of the rules of engagement given to the American carrier forces. Literally, if they met a Japanese task force in the wrong part of the ocean, they were given pretty much everything up to full engagement rights if the Japanese just looked at them funny. If the Japanese did anything which could be perceived as aggressive intent, and I am using that phraseology to cover the various tautology of words which are used in those rules of engagement, then frankly they could do a lot more. And that in many ways speaks to what the relationship is like between America and Japan at this point. One of the interesting things that often comes up in the discussions when we're talking about this is the president's ability to declare war. Now, yes, the power is technically vested in Congress, but in effect, the president has to persuade Congress. So they want to declare war, they have to persuade them. They have to give an argument. And Roosevelt has some advantages in this matter. He does have some advantages in this matter in the Congress as it's formed, etc. But usually the argument is based around his ability to declare war on Germany. Now, Germany is seen as a European problem, as something which Britain and the other European powers have to deal with, and is not seen in the same light, due to several domestic political factors, as Japan is. Members of Congress who would never vote for a war with Germany under any circumstances and would barring Hitler declaring war on them was about the only chance you had of getting on that side, were absolutely rabid with the desire to go to war against Japan. Why? Well, there's a range of factors, okay? The one most people, when they do actually usually jump on is racism, but honestly, that's not as much of a factor as the average American perception over what is America's backyard. And that's one of the troubles for Japan as a power when they were growing up, when they were becoming a major power. In that America's perception of its backyard was the entirety of the Pacific. And they developed this after the Spanish-American War, particularly, but they had it for quite a while. And this is one of the reasons why King is so persuasive in his argument, so focused in his argument to keep the British out of the Pacific as long as he can, to basically keep them focused on the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, where they are fighting anyway, and to limit the forces deployed, although there are still quite hefty forces deployed. Because the Pacific is the American territory. The Pacific is the American territory. And American backyard. And threats to their dominance in their backyard are things they do not treat well. So it's a really weird juxtaposition to get into, because you can find quotes from senators which are absolutely anti-war when they're talking about Germany. But they don't consider Japan in the same category in any way, any way, shape, or form. There are some who do. I'm not saying all the anti-war centers were the same. There are some, believe it or not, who are anti-war with Japan and pro-war with Germany. There is a far smaller group who fit in that category. There's always going to be some. When you've got enough people in Congress, enough senators, enough representatives, you're going to have some in each category. You always are. It's the law of large numbers. There's going to be at least one person in there who's holding views, as a set of views which do not make any logical sense to anyone. But, that's the way of the world. But let me put it this way. Doesn't make logical sense to anyone but them. And that's also a nice thing to have in the world. It means that there's usually something like a debate, something like a discussion, which is a good thing to have. Being able to have a debate, being able to have a discussion where you can talk about what's going on in the world, or random pieces of history, or even alternate history, and try and figure it through, is a good thing. Now, I know some people do not like alternate history videos, and I suggest you start watching now. There will be a lot of history discussed and a lot of things put forward, yes, but this video is not going to tickle your fancy. There's no chance of it doing it. It's going to be putting in a lot of information, and then it's going to be building up to look at a alternate historical scenario of how it could work. And I think I've come up with a fairly natural way. There were many suggestions about moving bases, moving seaplanes and patrol aircraft and patrol routes, and moving ocean liners, but of course they go on their circle routes, and so a lot of the merchant ships do, which is one of the reasons why it's also they are kind of predictable to avoid, and the Japanese do a massive amount of effort to avoid going to anywhere there's going to be merchant ships. And some people suggested fishing boats, but honestly, there aren't that many in that part of the ocean. There aren't enough. Honestly, you also needed to be someone who spotted them who is beyond reasonable doubt. Someone who is not going to be questioned by the high command if they are reporting this up the chain of command. And you've got to be in a scenario where the Japanese can be, to an extent, observed without observing it, because they technically have orders that if they think they've been discovered, they're supposed to go home. They're supposed to go home. So this is the route. And realistically, the parts where they cross the shipping lanes are the parts where they are closest to Japan. But even then, they avoid being in those shipping lanes for a long time. And whilst the best map of this, and I have seen it a few times, is set on a globe to really show, and you can put the shipping lanes on it. And on that one I've actually seen most recently does have a. They're all behind copyright, so I can't use those. Even under fair use, I think it'd be a bit naughty. So I've got this one, but it does serve to illustrate the problem. The fact is, the Japanese don't go right between where the Americans have any aircraft searching from, and any aircraft searching, and they've gone far out of the way to avoid where the Americans are positioning their bases and forces. Far out of their way. That's a problem. That is a problem. The route is specifically stacked and shaped and formed with the idea to avoid American searching and American discovery. And the Japanese are very even more cautious of it than you'd think they have to be, because they basically max out their ranges and their estimated real ranges, because they don't trust the American stated ranges of their aircraft to work this out, to avoid being spotted. So that's all a problem. That's a very big problem. We've got someone who has literally threaded the needle as much as they can to avoid being discovered. And we now have to make them discovered. Specifically, on the 4th of December. We have to have them discovered on the 4th of December, which means, if we look at this map, they're going to be in this area here. And that's also when they're in a bit of a storm. Now, the thing is, during the storm, they can't be launching aircraft. Not realistically. They don't historically maintain them during that period. So they probably can't, that's a bit of an advantage, but the storm does end. Now, the issues for the Japanese, as I've often had to get into, is the fact that they don't have a mass force viable for night flying, and they don't have radar. The Americans, when I say they don't have radar at this point deployed upon their ships on volume, en masse. Not because they don't have the science developing it. Please get this right. They do have science. They are working on radar. I've got into the story a bit before in other videos for Japanese radar. But the realistic issue is the scaling up the production. The British problem with scaling up production was pretty much they were being bombed by the time they were trying to do it. But they still managed to scale up production pretty darn well, and there's a lot of British sets on British ships, but they're also quite happy to take American sets when the Americans enter the war, and they can get hold of them. But there again, the difference between the American and British sets starts to narrow pretty darn quickly in the mid to late war. Almost as if the two nations are sharing a lot of information and working together, and as if they may be being assembled, especially the ones built in America, in factory, within yards of each other. Well, that's one side. The reality is, the Japanese force that's coming to attack the Kido Butai in 1941 is not the force the Japanese could have put together in 1944 if they'd waited for the technology then. But it's also a force which is being thrown in out of fear. Again, this is an important point to think about from the Japanese perspective on the war. The Japanese are not starting the war out of aggression. It's always put down as, it's a war of Japanese aggression. It's Japanese focus on taking territory and all these things. No, it's fear. It's from a dark, dark place, but it's not the aggressive place, it's the fear place. The vast majority of the Japanese high command believe they are already, even without a war, in a war with the Americans, and they are losing. They think they are going to be humbled. They are going to be bankrupted. They are going to have lost themselves, lost their nation without a fight. A large number, the majority of them, believe there is no chance of winning. There is little to no chance of winning a war with America, but it's better to have at least tried to fight the war and throw the dice to maybe win than the certainty of losing if they don't fight. That is not a good mindset. There are no good mindsets for starting a war. There are times when people start it with bellicose confidence, which is wrong, and basically any logic which leads you to starting the war is usually faulty logic, because war is not something which is started by rational, logical people. It's started by someone who's gone down a very nasty, very, very dark one-way illogical street. They have basically followed these decisions down until they feel they've got no other option other than war. That's their best option. So this is the scenario you have in the mindset of Japan when they're planning this, and so they're kind of paranoid. And still, when I talk about Pearl Harbor and the attack on them, I usually say it is either too good, performs its function too well in that it sinks enough of the US Navy, cause enough damage that the US Navy cannot come charging out across the Pacific because they are annoyed and upset and attack Japan. They can't come charging into all the plans which go beyond the strike and all these things, but into all the attrition operations they have planned, all the defense in depth they have planned, which would attrit the American forces. They propelled forward by their anger, disregarding their losses until finally they are a sufficient size so the Japanese can challenge them to a Kido Butai with a majority of the Japanese fleet fighting now a demonstrated US Navy. That's the plan. Or it's It's either too successful and it stops that, or it's not successful enough in that it not only doesn't cause that to happen, it doesn't force the Americans to immediately want to sue for peace and negotiate because they've lost so much. It's a devastating attack in many ways. There is a horrific loss of life, but it doesn't achieve any of the strategic or even tactical aims, you could argue, that the Japanese Navy were seeking in the medium to long term. It's short term, yay! Medium to long term, no. And the fact is, it's a desperate gamble from the get-go. Which is both a problem and the reason they're quite so paranoid with the routing. Again, this is the funny thing. If you're having to go to this much effort and to do all this to try and have a sliver of a hope of achieving anything, you might be in a situation which you're outclassed for. It's up to you. It's your judgment as to whether you think it's worthwhile. It is up to you. It's always up to you as a nation, but yeah. So here's the basic problem. You have geography and command, and neither of which are divided in ways which actually help you. Whilst the command structure that's used during the war is not technically in existence prior to the war, and when I say technically, I mean that the names and a lot of uncertain boundaries of things change rather quickly when war begins. So this map, which is a pretty fair representation, is for once the war's underway. Prior to war, de facto, they are actually pretty much dead areas again. Which again, if you think about it, means that this route... well, a hefty chunk of it is not in the Central Pacific, in the Pacific area. It's in the North Pacific Command. Now, the thing is, operating out of Kodiak Island and Hawaii, which are the main bases which are actually able to sustain PBY operations at this point, in this area to cover it, well, the one-way range of the PBY Catalina is 2,520 miles at this point. The range between Kodiak Island and Hawaii is 2,598 miles. In other words, if you try to fly between the two in your PBY, you run out of fuel 78 miles away. Now, there are ways you can get around that fairly easily, i.e. extra fuel tanks and things which you can, accommodate if you want to. But what that means pretty much is your patrol distances, which are going to be a lot shorter range than that, because you go out to patrol and then you go out to your distance and then you patrol a pattern in a certain area and then you fly home. There's a wide margin of ocean not covered. And the reason is a lot of American pre-war thinking and a lot of their wartime, when approaching war thinking, felt that the Japanese would concentrate on the Philippines. And they've orientated their assets as such. They felt that the routes between Hawaii and the Philippines were where to go, that the Japanese would go south or central. They wouldn't go north. Now, there are approximately 3 reasons that the Americans come to this decision, and they're all fair. 1, the Japanese have notoriously lightly built ships, which is how they've got round some of the treaty limits. This has resulted in them breaking their ships in rough storms. If you go north in the Pacific, you are getting into areas where there are very rough storms when they at certain times of year. And, well, at other times of years, it's quite big waves. The North Pacific is, unlike the extreme south in the Pacific, they do show where they are in the world in terms of their storm potential. The waters around Alaska and that area are no joke to anyone. So, to an extent, the Americans sort of felt the Japanese wouldn't go that way because they get their ships wrecked. That actually comes up as part of their thinking, as part of their discussions. And Okay, yes, you can say that's not a particularly... Well, they can still do it anyway and be prepared to take the losses, but Japan's already smaller than the Americans in terms of their mass and volume. They're already at a disadvantage. Why make that worse by tussling with Mother Nature? Why? Other reasons, there's not much up there that's worth hitting. There really isn't much up there that's worth taking apart if you're the Japanese. And finally, the thing is, to an extent, the Americans were suffering from the same hubris as the whole world, I would say at least the Western world, and suffered post-Cold War. I call that main character syndrome. The idea that you're in a movie about you. You are the protagonist. You are the main character. And it's used sometimes, that sort of phraseology in this description, but not often to describe nations at this point. And therefore, you are the one controlling the pace of events. The pace of the movie runs round you. It fits around your viewpoint. So if you're not yet ready for war, they won't take the risk of yet being ready for war. Now, this does leave the fact that most of the drama in a movie, especially an action movie, tends to come from the protagonist being caught off balance by the antagonist. But people always seem to forget that part of the movies. I don't know why, when they're trying to make this, when they are thinking about this about themselves. That they are both going to have a worthy opponent, and that opponent is not going to match up or surprise them in any way, shape, or form. Now, out of that, you have the various trade routes, the various Great Circle routes, etc., which the merchant ships are going through, which basically means that patch in the middle is not being patrolled by aircraft because they can't get there, and that's where the fleet's going through. And it's not got merchant ships, and it's not got fishing boats going through it. And you also have the problems then in this period. Not all fishing boats had radios at all, and even ones that did may or may not have a long range set. And the merchant vessels, their radio might be a receiver only to get the weather reports. And before you think this is the period, I usually give the example of the Falklands War. Okay? To pass signals to some of the merchant ships, the Royal Navy was literally flying around with a helicopter and dropping board with chalk writing on it down onto those ships by helicopter. Now you can say, well, they're on a mission silence. Yeah, but even the standard close-in radios they would use to communicate with ships in a convoy would not work. There was actual legitimate consideration given to, could we get some walkie-talkies? That would work, and it was decided that, sadly enough, the ones they could buy in time, in the quantities they needed time, wouldn't do the job. That's 1982. The radio situation does not get better the further back you go. It really doesn't. And liners, big ocean liners, there is no one going through that route. Because think about it out in terms of the Earth being not a straight line between anywhere, but a globe. So you go to circle routes, which are the quickest way between 2 points. If you're going from here, you need to get to here. If you go round here, that's a longer route than going over here. So what you're going to consider the Earth is not a perfect sphere. It's a bit squidgy. So, yeah, no one's going across straight lines between San Francisco and Yokohama. They're going... But here's the other problem as well for trading there. Even if I did want to move trade ships, the major trading partner between in this time period and the major trade routes had been America, Japan. With someone implementing sanctions, they actually make the Japanese job easier, because all those merchant ships which used to be flowing to Japan aren't. Okay, so then I thought, well, where are the aircraft carriers? Where are the aircraft carriers? And here the USNI comes in really handy, because the courtesy of Naval History and Heritage Command and the USNI, you have this. Now, Yorktown, Ranger, Wasp, they're all in the Atlantic, doing their job with the Atlantic Fleet. Hornet's just been commissioned and is sort of doing a shakedown cruise, trying to figure out what's going on with her. Saratoga has had a nice overhaul at Puget Sound, but she is nowhere nearby. She's in Puget Sound, Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. She's heading down to San Diego on some point on 4th December. She's in that area, heading along the route towards there. She's nowhere near operational. So that leaves me Enterprise in Lexington. Well, Lexington, on the 4th of December, she's sitting in Pearl Harbor, loading up. And Enterprise, on the 4th of December, she's at Wake Island. Neither of them are exactly in a position that's going to be helpful to me, are they, here on the 4th of December to discover them. But it does make it interesting if the Japanese are discovered on the 4th of December. It makes it very interesting, because it means that you can get at least 2 carriers into a battle position near the Hawaiian Islands if you want to. And again, if you want some fun reading, please go and read the very creative rules of engagement which are provided for those carrier battle groups when they're on their movements. There is a difference, and I don't keep having to emphasize it, but I feel I have to keep emphasize it, judging by the comments I sometimes get, between the American perception of war with Japan and war with Germany at this point in the political classes. There is a difference as to its value and its reality. Honestly, I think also there's the fact that it's going to sound strange. I think many of them perceive a war with Japan as a relatively easy war. I think that's where some of the other trouble is. They remember World War One. They think about the Germans and sort of that sort of war with the Germans, and I think that's what they're going to be dealing with the Germans. But the Japanese, for some reason, they haven't put into that same category mentally. They really haven't. So we're left with cruisers. We're really left with cruisers because they've got search aircraft. They can be bobbing around places. They can be hunting spotting things, and honestly, there is a task force wandering around which could sort of fit this. And I'm talking about Task Force 3. Now, they're based on the USS Indianapolis, and they're technically conducting a gunnery exercise, a bombardment, and to do it, they're using the various mine divisions of destroyers. Destroyers converted, Wicks-class and Clemson-class destroyers converted to mine, well, technically minesweepers, but they could also be technically used as mine layers if you look at their equipment. But, yeah. They are off doing that. The trouble is, to have them doing something similar to what they would require, they would need to be doing what would be called a surface action group. Today, in that period, a surface radar group. Now, again, mine division destroyers you wouldn't normally use for counter-surface radar operations. You don't use regular destroyers with the ability to use torpedoes, but there again, if you're searching for armed merchant ships and doing those things, then yeah, you might as well use the mine division ships, because frankly, you want to capture those merchant ships. And the Americans had done at least one exercise where they'd used them as that. So, the problem is, for it to work, you need a second cruiser, and you need to have You need to make sure they're both operating air seaplanes. Well, that's easy. Indianapolis does have hers. That does work for them. If you notice someone suddenly appeared, I told him to stop licking the chair. Now, the ship I chose to find, that was available, the only one that's available in, was USS Phoenix. But she was available. She's a Brooklyn class, which is pretty darn good, because that means she carries 4 aircraft. She's the US equivalent to the Town class in many ways, which means that as much as she is capable as a surface raider, she's supposedly built as a counter-surface raider. And she's neither just out of dry dock nor going into dry dock. She's sitting there. Phoenix is sitting there. And the thing is, if you have 2 cruiser captains, and this force out there operating as a counter-surface raider force, with this kind of structure, that's quite a competent force of of capable officers. B, and more importantly is always B, that's 7 seaplanes, an 8-inch gun cruiser, a 6-inch gun cruiser, and 5 destroyer mine layers. Now, this is not a force that's going to be able to take on the Japanese and win, but if they're in the right position, which they could be, considering where they were historically and where they were sent for exercise when they'd done this previously, they could well be in the right position. And as said, the criteria is the Japanese have to not know, because theoretically the Japanese instructions are, if you're spotted, head home. Which kind of just ends the entire assessment. If they're spotted and they know they're spotted, head home. So our scenario, and it's a simple one realistically, but it actually does work. Task Force 3 is doing an ASW anti-surface radar exercise instead. They're operating north, both cruisers have their aircraft up, and destroyers are doing what they do. They're basically pretending to be searching area. Maybe some of the destroyers are actually pretending to be the merchant ships, or the surface raiders that you have to find. One of them might be acting as surface raider, a couple might be acting as merchant ships, and then the rest are acting as extra vessels to send out. There's all sorts of scenarios where that works. And what we have happen, and what happens, is quite simple. During the big storm on the 4th of December, one of the aircraft spots the Japanese fleet. They see it. They spot it from high level through cloud, and they dip down through the cloud whilst there's still a quite big storm, but not too low, because honestly they don't want to get themselves spotted, but they also want to try and get the information, but with all the storm going on, they might well not be seen anyway. And makes out the fleet. They spot a couple of the carriers. Now, the Americans know the Kido Butai is not in port. And with no aircraft likely to intercept them, they fly back to their cruiser. Because no Japanese aircraft up, so there's nothing to intercept them. No Japanese radar to detect them, so they're gonna get. As long as they're not visually spotted, they're fine. And even if they're visually spotted, if they can get into the cloud cover, no one's going to really know what spotted them. But if they think they've been spotted, then they might well head home. So the thing is, you can't have spotted them. Now, the cruiser captain's instructions are not to go and attack a whole Japanese force, but it will be to message home. It will be to send a signal saying, This is what's happened. And that signal will go to Pearl Harbor. It will go to Admiral Kimmel. And then it will probably go up the chain of command, because Kimmel will probably start doing some preparations, but he'll send it up to Roosevelt. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the first thing that comes back from Kimmel is to the cruiser squadron, to Task Force 3, Shadow. In which case they're going to launch more aircraft in the direction of the storm. And they're going to try and keep a shadow. Now, while the storm's going on, they can probably keep that up. Keeping it up when the storm's gone, on the 5th and 6th, without being spotted by the Japanese, that'd be a lot more difficult. But also, there's the scenario that at that point, they might also be able to send some PBYs or other aircraft to head in that direction to have a look. Now, again, your problem is going to be if the Japanese spot you. The British put a lot of effort into developing, prior to the war, a shadow aircraft for their carriers. And the idea was it would be quite high flying, but it would also be very, very quiet and very, very, how do I put this, small in some regards. It was almost designed to glide, so it could get closer at night and see what the fleet was like without revealing its position by literally quietly throttling its engines very carefully across the enemy formation. The Americans never bothered to go in for that one. They, quite sensibly, they realised that would probably be a highway to nothing. The Royal Navy have these ideas because I think basically they read too many comic books, and they think the idea of gliding stealthily over your enemies and scouting them out would be a really cool thing to have. And let's be honest, it is a really cool thing to have. Practical? No. Cool? Yes. But I'm not here to discuss my theory of how Batman comics may or may not have influenced Royal Navy aircraft design. And before anyone wants to sort of clarify these things for me, Batman first appeared in Detective Comics number 27, May 1939, and the specification for that aircraft was June 1939. So yes, I feel there was a Batman influence going on, but we'll leave that to one side. No, I do not have anything to prove it. It's just timeline and some of the things they're talking about. Oh, well though. So, shameless book plug. I do this in every single video, and yeah. I do it to say thank you to everyone for your support. You're what makes this channel possible. You're what makes everything possible. Thank you for everyone who has bought a copy of the book. The book is important because it's what allows my career to work. Thank you. And there are more books hopefully coming soon. The Historiathon, which was on last weekend, well, you can still find the videos from that, and I think it went pretty well. It raised the money needed to fund the picture purchase for the first book, and also a trip to the National Archives in Kew, and the Marine Archives in Greenwich, and stay up in London for a few days to do that. So thank you very much. That was really, really kind of you, and I think it was a good enough performance that, in terms of what it raised and what it did, that I can go to charities and go, yeah, I'd like to raise some money for you. I was actually, although I have to say, I was thinking about next year maybe doing a slightly different form, and I'd like to know what you think of this. In this scenario, I did a Historiathon as basically a 36-hour continuous stream. I'm considering next year doing a scenario whereby I do 12 hours a day for 7 days in a row. Midday to midnight. And I pick 7 museums or naval charities to partner with, and each one, 50% of the money will go to one of them, and 50% of the money will go to funding my research. So each one is sort of, I'd like to see what you all think about that as an idea, because Honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to dedicate 36 hours to just one, because then it would take me ages to get through all the ones I want to do. Whereas if I could do 7 in one go, in 1 week, and sort of do 12 hours each day for 7 days, I could do one for each of them, and I could repeat that the next year, and I could do all 7 in each year. It's an idea I'm toying with. I have to say, I will emphasize the toying with. I was considering whether a 12 hours continuous stream would be enough. There was part of me which was thinking, well, maybe make it go from 10 till 2 and make it a 16-hour stream, so 10 a.m. till 10 a.m. till 2 a.m. and do that 7 days. But I thought, well, actually no, midday to midnight just sounds cooler than 10 till 2. But yeah, I would really be interested to hear what you all think about that, and whether you'd enjoy that idea, and whether it would work. The idea would again be much the same. There'd be a 3-hour presentation. There'd be 6 hours of there'd be 3 hours of questions, 3 hours of discussing whatever next year's essay competition and questions, and there'd be 3 hours of playing a game. And I'd try and pick. I try and do more than just World of Warships, but I have a feeling the World of Warships worked quite well, and I enjoyed playing the World of Warships everyone as a group, so I might pick that quite a bit again. But as said, it's something which I'd like some feedback on, of whether you enjoyed Historiathon, and whether you think that idea would work, or whether you'd like it to be the same as the Historiathon was this year, next year. So, with that being said, with the Americans keeping some form of track on the Japanese, and everything going on, who's going to be making decisions? Well, we often think it's going to be President Roosevelt or Hideki Tojo. That's who we ultimately think would be making decisions. And broadly speaking, in Japan, we're not necessarily wrong, but also not necessarily right. You see, the field commanders in this are Yamato and Nagumo. And if Nagumo thinks he's been spotted, his orders are technically to return to Japan. Like the American orders are technically to carry orders are, if the Japanese look at all threatening, engage first, ask questions later. When you consider also the commanders who they've picked to interpret the orders. That's one of the things. It's not just the orders, it's the commanders you've picked to interpret the orders. Ah, here's my shirt. But yes, Roosevelt, in many ways, he thinks a war is coming. He's certain a war is coming. Now, you could argue he's leaning more towards joining the European war because of his views on Nazi Germany, but he also hasn't exactly been a peaceable friend for the Japanese. He hasn't exactly been great for them. So, there is something going on here. There is certainly something going on. Now, as I started off with, and people misunderstood me when I talked about this in live because I didn't go into this in too much detail, the president doesn't technically have the power to declare war at this point. They don't still to this day, technically. Congress has the power to declare war. Which is all true. But the president is also a very powerful political entity in the United States, domestically and internationally. And they are, after all, the head of government and head of state, combined in one office. You want to go in? They are usually fairly capable, political savvy operators, and Roosevelt is definitely one of those. He's very capable at politics. And the thing is, I don't see him necessarily thinking about doing this as a declaration of war, but there are options which he could do. There are options he could think about and he could do, which could be it. And he could, in many ways, get away with it. With Japan. He couldn't with Germany. But with Japan, he's got more leeway. Because of the perceptions and because of the views of what's going on at the time. Still don't think I'm just randomly patting something between my legs. So, with Hideki Tojo, well, he has lied, cheated, and lied and manipulated and cheated in many ways to get to that position. He's fundamentally undermined any cases of civilian government with his pursuit of fulfilling what he believes is the Emperor's vision. And the trouble is with him and the Emperor is his view is, if the Emperor doesn't explicitly say the word no, then the Emperor agrees with him. The Emperor could even ask the question, are you an idiot? He literally have asked that question, are you an idiot? And Hideki Tojo would still believe he supports my position because the Emperor hasn't explicitly said no. The trouble is, when you're dealing with Japanese culture and society at this point, the Emperor doesn't say an explicit no. Or yes. That's not how the Emperor is culturally supposed to rule. They reign. They don't directly rule. And I've done a whole videos about this topic and gone into this and the issues of the realities of the genre and the way the Japanese system is supposed to work. And there are some serious problems with how the system is working in 1940, let alone 1941. So, please note, I'm not excusing anyone in this scenario when I say this, because there's always someone who goes, well, you're excusing... No, I'm not excusing anyone. And frankly, the Emperor probably should have just said a straight up no when he didn't want to do things. Then he is not pacifist by any stretch of imagination. I would say the Emperor, from reading, doesn't want a war with Britain or America because he realizes the situation Japan would be in such a war and that they would lose. They have a slight chance with Britain as it currently stands, but it's not a great chance at this point. It's really not a great chance. There is a lot of depth, there is a lot of space, there's a lot of capability within the British Empire to withstand things. And there's a lot of infrastructure in the British Empire. It's the same for the Americans. Hirohito wanted to avoid war with America. Please don't think that's the same thing as saying he's peaceful and doesn't want conflict and doesn't believe in a greater Japan and a Japanese empire. That's not. And this is the point you often have to make. People often presume when you, and I'll be getting into discussion as we go forward, it's not a black and white, simple binary decision, not wanting war. They don't want war with America. They don't want war with Britain. They don't want war with major powers who are a threat to them. They have no qualms about having war and conflict and doing things to people who can't threaten them. The Vichy French in Indochina. Those sort of things. That's the factor you're dealing with. Now, can I move my... Should I move my camera or should I move... I'll move my camera. Sorry, the poodle's now positioned himself, so I'm going to have to do something naughty and slightly move the camera over. Just a tad. So I don't keep going... Hello, and peering around the corner of the screen at you. With that being said, these are people who could actually be making decisions. Kimmel. Kimmel has very interesting rules of engagement and a natural tendency to action, and I could see him going, right, so the Japanese fleet are coming here. Let's organize some sort of ambush for them. They're maneuvering in their waters, let's make sure we're prepared so we can ambush them if they get close. And the point might be, and this is going to sound terrible, but even if you don't want a direct declaration of war, you could A, move the fleet out of harbour, and you could do that over the night of the 6th and 7th. Disperse the air defences, keep radars on, go to full alert, and yes, those are all technically, so a lot of those things are technically under the command of the army, but if Kimmel has got information from 2 cruiser captains and a destroyer force that their scout aircraft are tracking a Japanese fleet heading in that direction, would you want to be the general of the army who went, well, sir, you're not in my chain of command, so I'm not going to take any notice of you? No. And besides, the general and the admiral don't have that kind of adversarial relationship on Hawaii at this point. Now, Emperor Hirohito, he could be involved in making decisions quite dramatically, depending on what happens. And all this does depend on what happens. There's also Admiral Yamamoto. There are lots of options for what the decisions they might be making. And they might act before the leaders can necessarily make their moves. Now, I don't think Kimmel's going to. So I think we can safely rule that out. But it's also how would Yamamoto and Hirohito react to what the Americans might do as their options. That's where the things become interesting. Because there are roughly 4 scenarios we can end up with in this situation. Now these scenarios, broadly speaking, go 1. Roosevelt orders fleet to readiness, says nothing publicly or to the Japanese. And Kimmel basically gets to run his ambush strategy, probably pulling back Enterprise and her task group as fast to Pearl Harbor as they physically can get there, rearming her with flying aircraft off to her, having probably having Lexington leave as she was scheduled to leave, but having her maybe loaded even with aircraft for Enterprise, as an easy way of getting the aircraft to Enterprise. And having them meet up and forming a big task group. Probably getting the battle fleet to slip out the night before, in the early hours of the morning, when no one can really warn anyone what they're doing. You can do these things. And going to full alert. And basically, if you want to make it... If you really want to make it safe for Roosevelt, if he really doesn't feel he could get the necessary through Congress, he waits for them to hit Pearl Harbor, and where they're coming in, where everyone's already in shelters and nicely organized and safe. And then, as the aircraft are flying back to their carriers to land, the American carrier wings follow them in, attack the carriers, and attack the Kido Butai as the first wave is landing. That's an option. Combine that, battle fleet's out somewhere. If you take out the carriers in the first blow, then the battle fleet can try closing the distance, but let's be honest, the Japanese are probably reeling and trying to run at that point, and being harassed the whole way, and it's the weakest time a carrier can have is when it's landing or taking off aircraft. So yeah, that's a perfectly viable strike plan. Even with just 2 carrier groups, you can probably do quite a heavy damage. And if you combine in with land-based aircraft as well, maybe being armed up and dispersed and ready to fly off to do the attack, yeah, it would be not very good. The thing is, though, as much as there might be some conspiracy theories which like to put it forward, Roosevelt doesn't like the idea of sacrificing American lives. In fact, you can see from many of his decisions and some of the decisions which he makes, which are probably, how do I put this, most detrimental to the war effort, are usually predicated on trying to save American lives. I don't think he does it whether he allows them to have the first land the first blow. But we'll talk it through. We'll talk through the options. The others, well, they basically require Roosevelt say something. Sorry, I said nothing then. The first one says nothing. Second one, others require say something. A second, Tojo orders everything to carry on as is. They pretend that the fleet is just there for an exercise and they're doing nothing, so we're just going to carry on with what we're planning. Unfortunately, they probably ends up being similar to scenario 1, where the Americans are ready. Third, Dojo orders the fleet back and things get tense in the relationship, but no war actually happens. Fourth, Tojo gets removed by indirect imperial action. This could result in a civil war, but doubtful depending on how the emperor does it, because you have to remember the emperor has at several points done quite strong things to intercede to not, and I see this, to avoid war with the United States or Britain. That's not the same as not doing what you're doing in China or Korea or Indochina or wherever else you think you can get away with it. We're not saying that. We're saying avoiding war with America and Britain. There is a difference. I've been having some really interesting comments from people lately. So yeah, the first scenario, you have Enterprise steaming faster, her combining with Lexington, and they hit the Kido Butai. Now you can of course run this, you could run this offensive and you could actually have them hitting the Kido Butai as the first wave is taking off. If you manage to track the Kido Butai in, you could do that. How would you be tracking them close in without them spotting you when they're at the maximum alert status? Possibly submarines, but that's not really that great. There are options, but none of them are really particularly brilliant. The thing is, tracking them all in so you could lay a trap so you could actually hit them is probably going to reveal you as tracking them. So you've got to find a way to track them without tracking them. Now you could do that using aircraft, using especially long-range indirect track, especially once you've identified them. You don't necessarily need to be in perfect range of them to be for identification range. You need to be within tracking range, and that is slightly further distance. That is, it's not much further, but it's a little bit further, and it could be enough to avoid the cap and being spotted, especially if you've got good pilots running it. Now, the pilots who are on Task Force 3 in this scenario, they're probably going to be a regular mix of pilots. There's going to be some good, there's going to be some great, and there's going to be many average. That's a problem, though, because to do that kind of maneuvering with your observers and your pilots, they need to be exceptionally good teams. You could still do it theoretically, though, and you could still lay a trap, and as I said, your choice is going to be, do you let the first land punch to make it clean with Congress, so you don't even have to do a declaration of war with Congress, or do you rouse Congress from their bed at midnight on morning December 7th and tell them, we have been tracking a Japanese fleet coming in, maneuvering into this range. We haven't said anything. We've roused you all from your bed in the middle of the night to have this one-on-one meeting with you all. The Japanese look like have maneuvered themselves into position to attack Pearl Harbor. We are going to hit them first. You can decide that that's an act of war on our part, but they are within strike range of Pearl Harbor, and we can't afford to let them get the first blow. And it's a really interesting scenario if you do that, especially if you've also brought into the room all the newspaper editors you can grab hold of. So every newspaper editor you can get up at that time in the morning, and every senator. Now, please note, I haven't said members of the House of Representatives, because there's a lot more of them. But if you've got the 100 senators, and you've got the newspaper editors, newspaper editors probably informed in a different room, but informing them in the same room would be quite funny, because that would immediately cause a problem for the senators. Because if you say don't do anything and the Japanese strike and hit, that means you sacrificed the lives of Americans so that you would feel that so you didn't do anything. It's a dirty, nasty political trick to do. It's a really nasty political trick to do. And it's not going to make you friends because it's playing utterly pure hardball. But you are also backing them in a position where they can't afford to not support you. But that's the kind of thing which is very difficult to do without people taking notice that US senators have been in the middle of the nights removed from their home and taken to a meeting at the White House. It's very difficult not to notice that. It's not impossible to do it discreetly. It's really not impossible to do it discreetly. But it's difficult not for it to be noticed. Basically, the US Secret Service would have to be heavily involved. And yeah. They basically have to send a car. And I'm not sure if the US Secret Service in Washington at that point even has enough cars to be able to send enough cars to those houses to go and pick up all those people. Because we're talking probably would need somewhere in the region of 200 vehicles. I'm not sure if their fleet of vehicles at that time runs to that great a number in 1941. If they do lay a trap, though, if they do this, well, the Japanese fleet, the Kido Butai, probably ceases to exist. If you hit the Kido Butai as the strikes are being arraigned on their decks, you can take them out. If you combine that with the battle fleet heading there as fast as it can, forces heading there as fast as they can, and the carriers keeping up the strikes whenever they can, you could seriously destroy this part of the Japanese fleet. And then you have to wonder, what do the Japanese do? They can possibly still launch their operations against the Philippines, but if they do, the American fleet is completely all their attrition assets, which are supposed to attrit the US fleet as it was crossing the Pacific, are gone. Okay, the US can send their full fleet across the Pacific. And no, they're fine. They're going to have complete air superiority in any naval operation. It's potentially devastating for the Japanese. And it's probably going to shorten the war dramatically. But it's also going to change the war. I don't think you see... I think especially if the fleet gets annihilated in this sort of scenario, and the Americans start pushing back quite hard, and the fleet comes across, maybe the Philippines doesn't fall, and all sorts of things like that, I could see the war being a lot shorter, and I could see the war basically being Tojo Hideki falling on his sword and taking all responsibility, or rather being persuaded to, much like many of his faction were after the war was over, where it was made very clear, thanks to the work of several, honestly not Genro, led by Mitsumasa Yonai, that it was nothing to do with the Emperor. So, yeah, Roosevelt lays a trap. That's a shorter war and a lot less lost lives. But it's not exactly a nice thing, is it? And it doesn't strike me as what Roosevelt will do, because you're risking American lives either way. I don't think he does the laying the trap scenario. I don't think Kim was going to get that. Now, the Kido Butai carry on, and by the way, this is going to be one of the books. I'm going to do a series of little shorts. I'm just starting recording today, which are going to start up, which is going to be top 10 books for Christmas, which are 5 newish books and 5 older books, which are not new this year, but I think are very, very good and worthwhile picking up. As my top 10 books for Christmas 2024. Now, the Kido Butai carries on anyway. That's a tough one. That's honestly an unlikely one. It's probably the most unlikely. If Roosevelt announces they have spotted and are tracking the Japanese fleet heading towards Pearl Harbor on, I don't know, the 5th of December, I think Yamamoto orders them back long before Dodo even has a chance to do it, let alone probably Nagumo, possibly. A big announcement like that, they pull back. They're not stupid. They know they'd be running into a trap, and the criteria for Pearl Harbor being a success includes the Americans have to be unsuspecting. The Americans have to be at their lowest level of alert. One of the sort of interesting criteria is there's a whole debate as to whether or not literature actually says that the getting rid of Richmond, Admiral Richmond, makes this more possible. Because Admiral Richmond was known to be the absolute Japanese specialist. And as well as agitating for better defenses for Pearl Harbor and saying that Pearl Harbor is terrible, he's pretty much, got rid of because he is aggressively questioning the administration's positions on things. And they, of course, make the decision to not give Kimmel the same information access that Richmond had before him. They actually undercut their own commander-in-chief in the Pacific by denying him the very information which his predecessor had been using to argue against the positions they were making him take. And so he's unprepared. And so that changeover actually makes Pearl Harbor more of a viable operation, because the information basically the Americans have set up a situation where, for political reasons, because it's causing them political trouble, not because of any grand master plan. It isn't. People go, oh, it's a master plan to get them attacked. No, it isn't. It really isn't. It's stupid short-term political considerations. This man's causing me problems. This is the information he's using to cause me problems. To stop the successor man who I've put into his place going to cause me problems, I'll just deny that information. It's short-term politics. You could almost excuse it if it was part of... Well, you couldn't excuse it, but you could understand it as part of a grand plan. But it's such stupid short-term thinking, it's worse. At least as a part of a grand plan, they'd have an actual strategy going with it, an actual thought process going, not just... Oh, I don't want... They would cause me trouble, so I'm not going to let them have this. That's schoolyard toys. That's worse. These are supposed to be grown adults in charge of a frigging country. Not children. My little cousins act more mature than this. I'm talking about the really littlest ones. I'm talking about the ones in nursery. They act more mature than the US government, senior levels of the US government were acting at this point. People think it's a conspiracy theory. No, it's people who haven't grown up. And I'm sorry to the people who like to have conspiracy theories on those things. Usually the big problem with conspiracy theories is you are crediting the people involved with far more intelligence and capability than they actually have. I was so loud I actually caused a topple over of hard drives. Not sure if we're to be impressed or worried. But leaving that to one side, Kido Butai carries on anyway. It's going to work out as the previous one. It's just going to be nasty. Yes, they know, the Americans know, so they might be more alert. But the thing is, they are supposed to be launching that strike. They're going to be in that position. They're going to know they're being tracked, so they might try and change up speed. They might try and do different random maneuverings at night to try and escape their being tracked, and that might cause problems, but you just end up with a scenario whereby the carrier, as I said, the US Navy strikes follow back the returning strike from the Japanese. And they've lost every ounce of surprise and everything. They can't even expect the Americans. Also, the thing is, once you know, why are you going to expect the Americans to still be sitting in harbour waiting for you? They're going to be manoeuvring. You're going to have to go and find them, and while you're hunting for them, they're going to be hunting you, and it's just... It's a nightmare. It's really not a good decision. It's really a bad situation for them. Which leads us to something more interesting. Hideki Tojo orders a withdrawal. Now, this could be really interesting. Now, this agreement, historically, in 1917, was a masterclass in not saying anything. It was so vaguely worded, so vaguely structured that, frankly, it didn't have any matter. And one of the laughing things about it is, almost to an extent, the Americans are almost pretending the Japanese aren't one of the powers involved in World War One. When they were. But basically, the idea was, already at that point, the idea was, and so was America by the point it was signed, that they have basically divided up China between them. That's pretty much. It's abrogated in 1923, but basically they created such a vaguely worded note that it was a recipe for conflict and problems, but it was broad enough they could all agree and everyone could take a step back and peace would reign, and it signs away China's rights. Now, interestingly enough, the amount of times I get told by various people that no, the Americans were pure when it came to China. They were acting in China's defense against Japan, all these things. They're acting in defense of their interests in China. Please. There is certainly a moral quotient to that, and there is some moral outrage. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of Americans and their views are shaped by their interests in China. Eventually, it was replaced by the Nine Power Treaty and various other things in its time, but these treaties did things like affirming the sovereignty of China and the territorial integrity of it, but also recognizing things like the special interests in certain areas. For Japan, this was especially Manchuria. China regularly objects to these agreements, by the way, but yeah. At the time, the Chinese have no power to really do anything. So they can object all they like. It's not really going to bother the Americans or the Japanese. If you order a withdrawal, the thing that might come about is it might shock some people, especially with the idea that you could be that Germany could be at war with you soon. And as the neutrality patrols move ever and ever further and further eastwards across the Atlantic, yeah, this is not a recipe for a situation where that would happen. It could be sought. Now, what do I think it does? I think at best it buys you 2 to 3 years, where both sides are rapidly arming up. But it could also be a scenario whereby the Americans agree to drop some of the sanctions, which allow Japan to import fuel and oil and necessarily start making stockpiles, and America to concentrate on Europe for a bit. The problem that happens in this scenario is that if America ends up fighting the war in Europe already, and there's no war with Japan at the same time, the resources that can be shifted are quite dramatic. That's extra resources, extra personnel, extra troops, all going to European theatre initially. So that means Operation Torch probably can be launched earlier. That means all sorts of things can take place, which could accelerate the war in Europe. The question is, would the agreement, whatever agreement was reached, buy enough time to allow the war in Europe to be finished? If it does, then Japan is in a far worse state. far, far worse state, in far, far worse position. If it doesn't, if it still arrives after the war in the Mediterranean has really been won and the Royal Navy no longer needs to have a fleet in the Mediterranean, then the Japanese are going to be dealing with both fleets sending their major commitments towards them, their major forces, which is going to put them in a bad position. And there's also going to be all the ships built, the light fleet carriers based on HMS Unicorn. Although that was, I have to say, I've been having fun with reading books recently, which still treated like Unicorn's design comes from nowhere, when you can actually follow the design tracings and development. The light fleet carrier's design comes poof out of nowhere, when you can actually look at the design studies and the works which go into Unicorn, and you can actually trace the design studies and evolution through. But we won't go there. But yeah, it's a problem for the Japanese, this one. It is a problem for the Japanese. But it also fits with their rationale, and fits with what Tojo was technically under orders from the Emperor and everyone else to do, as much as the Emperor could give orders. If you lose the element of surprise, if you're supposed to turn back, and getting a diplomatic agreement, getting something which looked good in the papers for long enough to get it off the front page news and sorted these things out, that could be a viable option. It could be a viable option. The other scenario is this. Tojo, of course, doesn't order. He orders the fleet to continue, and he doesn't order it. In which case, the Emperor could actually act. The loss of surprise, the loss of therefore any chance of actually achieving what they're aiming for, the general desire view against War of America as being a sensible thing, the Emperor could well decide to act. At this point, and I talked about this, the Genro, and I've done a video where I've discussed this in terms of Mitsumasa Yonai, and what happens if he becomes Prime Minister again, the second term, because that was a question put forward for people, because people like Japanese questions on this channel. I like studying the Japanese history, I find it interesting. It's also quite interesting to me how it is a monarchical style government. And people try and put it as a dictatorship, but no, it's not. It's a monarchical government. It's people acting in the name of the king, or of the emperor. And the thing is, that's where their power stems from. The trouble for the emperor is, by not having any declared Genro anymore alive, because having Genro caused political issues, because Genro pretty much appointed the prime ministers. And it was too powerful. It was a power base which was outside of the army and the navy when they are publicly declared. And they are something which the army and navy both have to pay attention to, and other factors have to pay attention to, because Genro were literally almost declared representatives of the emperor. They were the people who the emperor could speak to, make suggestions to, and what they said were therefore they were acting as the voice of the emperor, which is one of the reasons why Mitsumasa Yonai I often consider a Genro, because of course his final gift from the emperor, I know this is off topic but it explains this, is inkstone, is ink and a pen. The emperor giving him his personal items, his personal ink, his personal pen. Partly that symbolizes, you are going to be writing for me. You are going to be writing the words, especially as at that point Yonai was involved in setting up the new constitution, preparing Japan for the post-war world, etc., and all these things. That's basically what a Genro is. The emperor, because of the way the system is structured, cannot speak. They're not supposed to speak speak publicly in terms of, in that way of saying no or right. They're not supposed to rule. They have to reign, and they it's one of the traditional methods they used for reigning for quite a lot of the period the emperor was in charge and his predecessors were in charge, were through the genro, who these basically very senior, eminent samurai, politicians, etc., who had basically been given this almost semi-official title, which basically meant you were a representative, you were an anointed representative of the emperor. And they don't always agree with each other, but they don't fight each other, generally. They're basically like a family. So if he declares someone as that publicly in this period and says, I have appointed this person general, and they have appointed themselves prime minister. Basically, they get appointed general and they appoint themselves prime minister. They can order withdrawal. There are ways you can bring down Tojo's government. You can have the army and navy withdraw their senior officers from it. And if there is a general appointed by the emperor, he can go to those officers and go, you will no longer serve in Tojo's government, in Hideki Tojo's government. And they have to pick a choice. They have to do, are they going to side with the emperor, or are they going to side with Tojo? And the trouble is with siding against the emperor, the emperor doesn't have a lot of force until you actually act against him, because the thing is, Japan is a balance of factions. There are lots of factions involved, and those factions all want to believe they would be better acting as the emperor's ministers. They would speak more accurately for him. The point is they're competing for that position. If the emperor says this faction, or rather this leadership of the faction, is no longer up as delivered through a general, the idea that this faction no longer speaks for him, then the others are going to be in a race to tear you down to replace you. They're not going to be forming coalition alliance. So quickly you find yourself surrounded and outnumbered, and there are so many factions. It's a real problem. Again, the only real candidate I can see at this point for that would be Mitsumasa Yonai. There are a couple of others who are potential, but the thing is, Mitsumasa Yonai has enough respect and power within the Navy that, remember, he's the man trusted to bring the Navy home after the war ends and get them to follow the peace deal. Even with the minister not agreeing with him, he could probably on his own, even without being a declared general, could probably get the minister to resign and cause Tojo's government to withdraw, to fall. With being acknowledged as a general, and as said, I would say the pen and ink after the war basically are pretty much an acknowledgement of his status in that regard, and I think he was acting in de facto that status for a lot longer. With that, he could probably organise other things, and there are a few others. The thing you have to remember about General is that even though if they disagree with each other, even though they don't like each other, they are acting on behalf of the Emperor. They are basically the Emperor's shadow council. If the Emperor has said this person needs to go, they are as close as the Emperor has said. So I said something like to them, I question whether this man's judgment is still relevant to lead Japan. It wouldn't even have to be an instruction of kill him, get rid of him. He'd be gone. Because that's how the Emperor works, and that's what these people are basically for, interpreting that. You then could have, I suppose there is a chance you could have a civil war in Japan. I don't think you'd have much of one. As said, I think the factions would, broadly speaking, fall against it. And while they're dealing with these internal issues, again, it's going to be much the same as a new, Lansing Ishii agreement. It's going to buy time. The thing is, if they're trying to avoid war with America, then they might start emphasizing their deterrence capabilities far more. And one thing that might be to talk about is they might do a public announcement of what the Yamato class are actually capable of and how powerful they are and all these things, which could well force a fair number of interesting construction items to appear in various various nations. I think you could also get a re-emphasis from the Japanese perspective of rebuilding their own infrastructure and maybe getting some form of Lansing Ishii agreement. Again, the other advantage we're going with Yonai, there's one other who possibly could have the same advantage, but Yonai is pretty much one of the most advantage, is he has good connections in both America and Britain. If anyone can bring some stability to the situation, he can. It's not much chance of him bringing stability to the situation, but it's better than most, and there are options which I've explored in the past for what he could do to really bring some stability. But pretty much, the Emperor doing this is, I would say, far more likely than Tojo just carrying on with the strike and nothing happening. Now, as said, I don't see the Emperor maybe getting on the radio and going, kick this man out of office. I don't see him doing that. But turning around to his special advisors, his people, and, as said, phrasing as a question of, is this man really fit to run my country? Or I question if this man is fit to run my country, or something like that, would be enough. It would be enough, especially under these circumstances. That's also quite blunt speaking for Japanese court speak. And very, very blunt speaking for Japanese court speak. I will not try and pronounce my Japanese pronunciation when it's outside of individual words, which I can learn to pronounce. It's still not great. I'm trying to learn it for a trip to Japan next year. And basically anyone who's got a good advice for learning Japanese, please send it my way. But the thing I do know is the difference between the common dialect and the court dialect is it's even more complicated. And in many ways even more beautiful. It's got a beautiful lyric to its tonality and its phrasing, but yeah, it's not for direct communication. Now there are some other complications in the room. There really are some other complications in the room. Complication number 1. Winston Churchill. Why is he a complication? Because if Roosevelt makes that pronouncement that, Japan are heading for the Japanese fleet being spotted, expect him to make a stirring speech saying he will side with America. He will stand by the American cousins across the Atlantic, and expect him to start trying to mobilize whatever forces he can to send to Singapore. That's not exactly going to calm waters, but yeah, Winston is going to go full, we will fight along our side, our English-speaking brethren. We will fight them in the Pacific. We will fight them in Asia. We will fight them in the Atlantic. We will fight them in Europe. We will fight them in Africa. We will fight tyranny wherever tyranny be found. Thing. It'll be a rousing and powerful speech. Now, Hitler, of course, this gentleman who believes fundamentally great nations are not declared war on, they declare war, could see this, think, war's coming with America, I need to take advantage of this and jump in and declare war. Like he did actually do historically after Pearl Harbor. Because, what can I say? Whatever brain cells he had which got him elected and allowed him to do all the things he did weren't working that day. I'm not sure how many brain cells are up there in the first place. I really don't, but he had managed to manipulate the Weimar Republic system to get himself elected. Admittedly, Weimar Republic is not that great a system. It really isn't. Look at how they're treating defense spending, and things like the Deutschland class, etc., all start long before Hitler comes to power. So yeah, and that causes a whole interesting thing, because what happens if Hitler declares war and the Japanese withdraw their ships? Either options 3 or 4. Then Roosevelt's now at war with Germany, and that war's been declared by Germany on him, and they've not got a war against Japan. Uh, if you want to have a really fun time working through this in any kind of simulation matrix and doing sort of any kind of D&D rules of rolling dice, etc., give whatever else you want, it doesn't become it becomes what's sometimes referred to as a statistically significant chance of this actually happening. A statistically significant chance. Because his decision to declare war on America in the first place after Pearl Harbor is sufficiently illogical that he could jump the gun. And it could find that Italy and Germany are at war with America, but Japan isn't. Now, I know there is the Tripartite Pact and all these things, but as said, Hideki Tojo does support that, but how much does he support that? Does he wish to go down on based on that? And in scenario 4, where he finds himself removed from power because he tries to continue on the fleet, the movements, I could see Hitler doing this, having done this, and then finding that Japan is no longer his ally because the person who's supposed to be in charge no longer in charge. And that does add to things. That adds to a whole scenario. Again, it means the European war is going to be heavily emphasized and the American forces are going to charge into that. Does it mean there's going to be peace between America and Japan? I'd say scenario 4 is the closest scenario where that's a possibility. I really would. Because you have a complete governmental change in Japan, and that probably means, for that to happen, then a lot of the hardline people who support Hideki Tojo probably get weeded out quite quickly. Economically, I'm not sure what this does for Japan, but they can, if they're not actually fighting a war and they do actually manage to get some sort of agreement with America over, in terms of getting the sanctions drawn down, they could pull something off. They could pull something off interesting. And if America's busy fighting a war in the Atlantic and Europe and North Africa because Hitler and Mussolini declared war on them, then that might also mean the Americans, to an extent, take a little bit more of a back step on Japan. Don't start to keep applying quite so much pressure. There have been lots of problems with Japan and America in terms of their diplomatic communication. One of the more interesting ones is earlier on is that the Americans keep insisting on the Japanese making concessions before you have negotiations. And for the Japanese, it's very important you don't make concessions until you're in negotiations. And it's a different approach to diplomacy. In one side, concessions are a sign of good faith before you get in there. In the other side, concessions before a negotiation are seen as a sign of weakness, whereas concessions made in negotiation are seen to be given from a position of strength. always study the diplomacy and diplomatic culture of the nations you're negotiating with, because you sometimes have to think, well, from our perspective, we have to demand concessions before we can meet with them. But the thing is, it's actually easier for us to meet with them and ask to accept not having this than it is for them to give concessions beforehand, especially in a scenario where there are ministers and people getting killed because they aren't perceived as doing the correct thing for Japan by different factions. Yeah, there's a slightly different symmetric going on here. Adjust to it. So, summary: what happens with Japan? The Kido Butai being spotted 3 days out from Japan, 3 days out from Pearl Harbor. Most likely, Roosevelt announces it. And I would say most likely the Japanese fleet withdraws. Now, the interesting question is whether they withdraw because Hideki Tojo orders it, or whether they withdraw because Yamato orders it, and when Tojo tries to remove Yamato over it, the Emperor acts. Or rather, the Emperor's already rolling, and that just neutralizes that. And what Adolf Hitler gets up to, and whether or not he decides to declare war on America in the meantime. These things are all the things which are going to be the variables that come out of it. I think if it's Tojo who orders the withdrawal, then as said, I think you buy time for roughly 2-3 years before there is war. If it ends up to Tojo being forced out, things could be different. Things could be very different. That's the history we got. Now, I normally finish these videos with a question. And I'm not going to change that now. So the thing is, I was looking at this scenario and thinking, what other bit from history, what other time has there been a strike which has been coming in and, well, has been able to deliver from a position of surprise? I thought, well, what happens if the Italians spot the fleet coming from Taranto? That's sort of a predictable one, but it couldn't be 3 days out. That's the thing, and they're already in wartime, so it doesn't really have the same options to it. It's the same with Toshima, if you try and throw that on. Basically, we're in a unique period in World War II where we now have technology to spot these things coming. So the question instead started me thinking about, what does America and Japan do if it's the scenario where Tojo does order withdrawal and they do have a 1941-1942 equivalent of the Lansing Issue Agreement. A, what do you think that agreement say? Because please note, you can look into the details, the things the Americans were offering. Again, I covered this in the video about the Genro and Mitsumasa Yonai, and what happens if the leadership changes in 1941. The fact is, the Americans were offering quite some interesting things for negotiation. We're prepared to offer some quite interesting things negotiation-wise in any discussion about China and Japan, including the fusing of the Japanese-appointed government with the Chinese-appointed government and recognition of the certain areas as belonging of parts of China belonging to Japan. And it's really interesting when you start reading through it, because de facto, the Japanese could achieve their puppet government taking over China if manipulated right. So the thing is, what I'd like you to think about is what would actually be built if you give Japan 3 more years and fuels turn back on for those 3 years, and America 3 years, and you can decide whether you think Hitler declares war or not. Toss a coin. I think that'll be about as accurate as is about the actual even chance. And what happens in those 3 years? What do you think? I'm not talking diplomatically or politically between people. I'm talking about what do you think they're building in those 3 year period. The Americans, of course, are concentrating on the Essex swarm coming down the road. So what are the Japanese building to counter it? What are the Japanese doing? And yes, there is a good argument against such an agreement, because let's be honest, the more time goes on, the more the infrastructure bell starts to toll for Japan versus the America. But there again, getting such an agreement, giving them breather to organize themselves and maybe develop other things, I-400s perhaps. Yeah, there are some advantages to it. So I'd like to hear what you think about it. And, well, the Year of Aircraft Carrier has been done now. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. But this is what we're doing now. And HMS Castlemaine is Monday. 2 Historians are Tuesday. Scuttlebutt 8 is Wednesday. Thursday is the Monroe Doctrine Live. Key Aircraft Friday. And 2 submarines in 2 wars. All the sinkings are taking place in 10 days in November are going to be discussed by submarines on next Saturday. It should be a good thing, and I've got lots of 2 historians coming. I think I'm recording 2 episodes of 2 historians next week. I think that's what I'm down to do. If I remember correctly, yes, I am. And yeah, it should be fun. It should all be fun. Take care, and thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed.